ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hedley Thomas first started visiting crime scenes and reporting on murder cases on the Gold Coast back in the 1980s. His curiosity, along with an old-school dogged pursuit of justice, eventually led Hedley to the case of Lynette Dawson, or Lynette Sims, as her family now want her to be known. And Hedley's reporting on Lynn's disappearance in the hit podcast The Teacher's Pet culminated in Chris Dawson finally being convicted of his wife's murder. Hedley has continued making podcasts and writing stories that work to solve cold cases of murdered Australian women. Less well known is that Hedley's family has its own story of a missing mother. Hi, Hedley.
Hey, Sarah.
Your dad was also named Hedley. The original Hedley Thomas was a pilot in the Vietnam War. What did he tell you about his service?
Well, he served as a Royal Australian Air Force pilot, and he was in Vietnam when I was a little boy. We were living in Canberra then, and Dad, when I was older, was very defensive about Australia's involvement in Vietnam, and I think proud of the fact that he and other RAAF officers had done their bit. It was clearly a dangerous time because he was flying choppers and doing what were, very risky missions, pulling out Australian and American officers and soldiers from hotspots, often under enemy fire from Viet Cong, and I could tell that Dad was troubled about the risks that were taken, and I know that he would have had some post-traumatic stress from that because pretty much everyone who went there did. But he didn't really dwell on that. You had to ask him about it. Sometimes he would get a bit reflective and mention it. And, I'm really grateful to my nephew, young James Frizzell, because for a high school assignment, he interviewed his granddad and got Dad talking about it some more, and I've got the audio of that, which is fantastic.
Was your dad a pilot before the war?
Yes. Yeah, he always wanted to be a pilot since he was a teenager, and he did his training as a teenager, and then he was accepted into the Royal Australian Air Force. He was originally flying jets, and then he had an accident, and it was decided that he would be better off in helicopters.
Did you go up with him in planes or in choppers?
I did, yeah. I remember when I was very young, we went up because in Canberra at Fairburn, which was the Air Force base, there would be events for Christmas, and Santa would jump out of a helicopter and the kids would get their presents, and we had a couple of joyrides then too.
What do you remember, Hedley, about things ending between your mum and dad?
Well, Mum and Dad sat us down and, it was obvious that they were not getting on. We could tell, there were lots of often loud arguments, and Mum believed that we should move to Queensland. I don't think Dad was in favour of that at the time because we lived in Canberra and Dad's career was with the Air Force in Canberra. So that was another source of some tension, that Mum wanted my sisters and I to move to Queensland with her. We moved to Queensland after a couple of holidays in the north. So we went to originally Rainbow Beach, which is just east of Gympie, and absolutely loved it there. It was so different to Canberra, and the beach and the sunshine and the relaxed lifestyle of Queensland in the late 70s was something else.
It's a big move for your mum to have taken as a single mum with 4 kids. What do you remember about actually moving eventually to the Gold Coast? So different from being on holiday, but actually, setting up life, going to school in this different part of the country.
Yeah, look, it was a pretty risky move too, because we weren't blessed with wealth, and Mum had to strike out on her own, and I remember thinking this is also new. I've left behind my friends in Canberra. I had been going to high school. I just started high school in Canberra, and on the Gold Coast, because of the age difference and the different schooling systems, I was to go back to the last year of primary school. And it ended up being Surfers Paradise State Primary, which was a really cool school on the Isle of Capri. And there really were not very rigid uniform standards there, and I discovered that when I met my classmates, and half of them were wearing board shorts and T-shirts and wearing thongs on their feet. So I thought that was nice. Like, I didn't want to be in a suit or a blazer and tie anymore either, so that suited me too, and I loved it. And I discovered soon afterwards the world's greatest fruit, the mango. And I remember the first time I ate a mango, it was when we jumped off the school bus near Mudgeeraba, where we'd moved. We'd built a house out there. Mum had organised for builders, and she'd got a little acreage, and we jumped off the school bus near this creek and trespassed and some property, and my friend said, "Oh, there's some mangoes, let's grab those." And we were going swimming in this waterhole and had the mangoes afterwards. And as soon as because I didn't know what a mango was, we didn't eat them in Canberra, it must have been too expensive or exotic or something. And I couldn't believe it, that incredible sensation from all the sugar.
You get to wear thongs to school and eat this afterwards. Yeah, that's a big tick. So you liked the more relaxed atmosphere of school at the Gold Coast. What sort of report cards did you get at high school, Hedley?
Yeah, look, all the teachers pretty much said, Hedley's got a lot of potential.
Most damning of phrases. Potential.
Yeah, when he applies himself, he does great work and can ace things, but he's too easily distracted. He needs to focus more in class and needs to, do some homework as well. And, that was a consistent theme. Like, if there was something I really got interested in, I would give it my all, but a lot of it I found pretty boring.
What else was taking your attention outside of the classroom at high school?
The beach, Space Invaders.
Where would you play Space Invaders?
Oh, there were a couple of places in Surfers Paradise, and we'd wag school and just haunt those joints. And we'd worked out a way to get constant replays, so we didn't have to keep putting the 20-cent piece in. I think you'd probably call that fraud now.
I think you would. Yeah. You had a brush with the police, not for fraud reasons though, in your last year of school. What happened? Yeah,
well, this is where I guess I talk a bit about being also an underage gambler, Sarah. So brace yourself. We had been at the Gold Coast Greyhound racing track where my friend from school worked part-time on the tote, and we'd go there and think that we were pretty cool and growing up, because my girlfriend was also working in the milk bar there at the time, so we'd get free caramel milkshakes and have a few bets and then drive back to Main Beach, where we were then living in the Golden Sands high-rise. That was the regular Friday evening, and this particular night we'd had a really significant win. One of my great friends, who's still a terrific mate to this day, 40 years later, he was turning 17 that day. We were all 16, and we didn't know what we should buy him. And we decided that we'd take up an offer from one of the other school prefects to buy him some marijuana, a small amount of marijuana. I mean, we're 16, we're living near the beach. You're experimenting with grass, and so we did that, and we were driving this vehicle that was unregistered. It had been hand painted the week before, and my mate who worked at the tote, he didn't have a driver's license. So we were doing everything wrong: underage gambling, driving an illegal car, and
illegal substances.
And we had weed, and so near the Southport Yacht Club, after we'd had some of this prohibited substance, and we were driving down Main Beach parade towards Surfers Paradise and got near Narrowneck, and that's when we became aware that there was this flashing blue siren atop a police car that had been following us for a little while and pulled us over, and that's when the police discovered that we had a significant sum of cash on us, which was winnings from the dogs, and the smoke was still probably billowing from the vehicle, which when he ran the checks, clearly came up as unregistered, so took us down to Broadbeach Police Station. And this was just a few years prior to the Fitzgerald inquiry. And you would have thought that there was a fair chance a Queensland copper might have said, righto, boys, you can walk home and I'll confiscate that cash and see you later. You don't need to say any more about this. But no, they thought, well, we'll drive them all home and tell their parents what's been going on. And so that's when one of the officers in the early hours of the morning then, Saturday morning, drove me back to Main Beach. And Mum was woken up, and by that stage I think Mum thought I was probably going one of two ways. I'd either work out that I needed to put my head down and do what my school teachers said I should do, or I was going to end up in what was then known as Boys Town, and that was a regular warning that I got, probably every Gold Coast adolescent got. And I think it was the most embarrassing moment of my teenage years, because when the police officer produced a sample of this green leafy material, Mum, and told Mum that I'd been smoking it, she replied, "But why would Hedley be smoking my parsley?"
Genuinely, with genuine innocence, not as a...
I think so. I'm sure it was genuine. And I couldn't understand that because, Mum had lived through the 60s. Like, what was she thinking? But it was just like, oh my God.
So did that end up being a turning point for you? Did you see Boys Town looming and change things, or think, wow, I could get away with this stuff more easily than I feared I could?
I reckon that it did give me a wake-up call. Yeah, I definitely started to take life and school and responsibility a bit more seriously. My dad was disappointed because he soon was told about it. Look, I think you make decisions when you're 16, your brain's only half formed, and you're having fun with your mates and you talk about it, and we laugh about it now. 40 years later, I catch up with the same friends and we retell the story, and, it gets a bit embellished.
You mentioned that your dad had always known that he wanted to be a pilot. What about you? Was journalism something that was always on your mind? Yeah,
I knew that I was fascinated by newspapers and journalism through high school years, because I would often go off to the library. So, teachers said Hedley doesn't apply himself, but I would go to the library several days a week to read the Gold Coast Bulletin newspaper, which would come into the school library.
What was that about, do you think?
I think it probably goes back to early childhood and seeing Mum and Dad also fascinated by papers, and knowing as a child that your parents, who you look up to so much, identified in these black and white newspaper pages something special, something magical, something that took their attention, even when you were trying to get their attention, clambering over their back. And it was like, oh yeah, just a minute, I just want to finish reading the story, or you should learn a bit about this. And so I think that probably fired an early interest. And I've always been curious. Like, I prefer doing what you're doing, Sarah, which is asking questions, not answering them. But in the news pages, I discovered so much that I found fascinating.
So where did you first get your foot in the door in the newspaper industry?
Yeah, well, my then girlfriend's parents were really good friends with a journalist called Matthew Condon's parents. And Matt Condon was already at the Gold Coast Bulletin when I was in high school. He'd got a cadetship and he'd begun writing these amazing pieces, including a 3-page spread on the opening of the Paradise Centre in Surfers Paradise.
3 pages, barely enough.
I know. How did he string it out? That's probably why I overwrite. He was my mentor for ages. And I had, as a result of that connection, an introduction to the editor of the Gold Coast Bulletin, John Burton. And John was a really, just such a kind and measured editor. He'd been a newspaper journalist for many years. And John, at the first interview that I had with him, said, look, you obviously don't have any experience in journalism because you're still in high school, but we could offer you potentially a job as a copy boy. He explained that the copy boy job would be very junior role, running around the newspaper, attending to all the different departments. So this was the last year of typewriters in a newspaper. And the sub-editors would make strange markings on the reporters' little white pages of copy paper, which were their stories. And I would pick up that copy paper and run it down to the typesetters, and I'd go up to photographics, and I'd dealt with advertising, and I'd fetch lunches and organise the expenses claims. That's where I first discovered the art of creative accounting in newspapers. And I got to know everybody. I really loved it.
A great grounding, really, in the sense of how the whole place worked.
Yeah.
From copy boy, Hedley, you went on to be sports writer and then got your break into crime reporting. How did you keep track of all the stories that were breaking across the Gold Coast?
Well, we had an illegal interception device called the scanner. And I think every journalist then, maybe even the ABC, had scanners.
I couldn't possibly say.
And these scanners were amazing. They tapped into the police and fire and ambulance radio channels, and they would start squawking when something was being said of significance, and a lot of, insignificant banter as well. But the police had codes for certain matters or offences, and we had a little cheat sheet of what the codes were. There were 3 number codes. And my recollection is that a murder was a 101, and as soon as you heard a 101, you were turning up the volume and telling everyone to shut up. And this was the desktop scanner in the Bulletin in Southport. But I also had a portable scanner, and that was the size of a house brick that I could take in my car. And then I became a little bit infamous because I was going to bed with the scanner so that I could hear it. If something happened through the night, my ears would prick up and I'd wake up and go out and check it out. So I think a lot of the police reporters were doing the same thing. We needed to be on it.
What was the first big story that you broke once you started covering crime?
One of the first stories that I broke in relation to corruption and crime was concerning an illegal casino on the Gold Coast. And it was this really cool place above a gelati ice cream bar in Cavill Avenue in Surfers Paradise. And I only knew about this place because my friends and I used to frequent it for pre-drinks before we'd go to the Bombay Rock or wherever we were going. So I'm still in high school at this stage. And so we'd be pretending that we knew something about, roulette or blackjack and feeling really grown up, but just going there so that we could have 2 or 3 rum and cokes or whatever we were having and be out of there. Vodka and orange was the other favourite drink in the 80s. And then when I was a cadet reporter and the Fitzgerald inquiry and police corruption and the incredible work by Chris Masters and Phil Dickey started making an impact, I thought, well, this suggestion that there's no illegal gambling and no illegal brothels in Queensland is pretty ridiculous. I'll do a story on the
place I used to go as a high schooler.
Yeah, that I was in just the other week, And so I did, and one of my, in fact, the mate that we bought the weed for his birthday, he still ribs me about that because he says, you got that joint shut down, that we were still going there, and, you'd been going there too, and you didn't put in your story that you did used to go there, so that was all true.
So you got a sense, I guess, of your reporting having effect in the real world.
Yeah.
Straight away.
That's right. And I also, although it was probably a subconscious sense then, I realised that police ministers and police commissioners don't always tell the truth.
Were you ambitious to make it as a reporter when you think back to that young bloke at the Gold Coast?
I was probably just enjoying the Gold Coast lifestyle, surfing and going to the track with mates and still going to the Bombay Rock and wherever, until I got a flatmate called Paul. And Paul was really ambitious, younger than me, doing everything in a big hurry, and clearly seeing the Gold Coast Bulletin as a stepping stone to bigger and better opportunities in journalism. And he would often say, it's a bit like that Animals song, we've got to get out of this place. And I guess it caused me to start thinking about moving on, and I got a job at the Courier Mail. And after 1 year at the Courier Mail, Greg said, there's an opportunity for a young journalist from Australia, from the company, to go and work in the London bureau for a couple of years. Would you like to be a contender for that? And I thought, that's amazing. I'd love to do that. I'd only ever been to Guam. And that was on a travel junket that I'd had just months earlier. From Guam to London, that was a huge step.
Whatever ended up happening to that ambitious younger bloke, Paul, who you were sharing the flat with?
Well, he ended up becoming the editor-in-chief of The Australian and now the CEO of Sky News. Oh, and my brother-in-law. I buried the lead. He married my youngest sister, who would often be visiting us in the flat in Southport.
And if it hadn't been for sharing that flat with him, you might still be sleeping with a scanner under your pillow at Southport.
That's a really interesting point. I wonder where I would have gone because, Paul definitely helped fire me up. And because he's so competitive, although friends, we were competing with each other. Like, we used to race up to the Gold Coast Bulletin late at night and grab the first editions of the newspaper that had just been printed so that we could see how our stories had been used, and then we'd sort of dissect the way they'd been buried or hadn't been used as well as we'd like and pretend we knew what we were talking about. So we were definitely becoming increasingly invested in journalism.
After your stint in London as a foreign correspondent, where you covered some huge stories, including the collapse of the Soviet Union, you ended up in Hong Kong. And by this stage, you were attached. You were there with your wife, Ruth. How did you end up in a back of the limo there with the current president of the United States?
Yeah, well, by November 1998, Ruth and I had been in Hong Kong for 5.5 years. We'd been married up there, and we had a child on the way, our son Alexander, and he was due any hour. And I was going through some of the material that was pouring out of the fax machine in the features department, and there was a note that had been sent from a woman who worked for this fella, you might have heard of him, Donald Trump. And he was a property developer in New York who his office advised was about to visit Hong Kong. And they went into his incredible CV in this
Incredible.
fax.
The best, in fact.
At everything, and I just read it thinking, God, this guy's got tickets on himself, but could be a pretty cool interview for the weekend, particularly if I quote from the publicity bump. And so I got back to the New York office and said, I'd be happy to meet Mr. Trump. And so I met him at the new Czech Lapkok airport, and he was very friendly, and we proceeded to his limousine, and I asked him, how many dozens of questions on the way into central Hong Kong. And he was interesting, and I was asking him about his ego, because he was naming all these buildings after himself, and he explained that they sell better when he names them after himself, and that he didn't know anyone who was successful who didn't have a huge ego. And I asked him about rumours that he might want to run for politics, and he said, maybe, but, I don't know about that. I'm not really thinking about that. And I asked him about the state of politics at that time, and that was at the time that Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky and Kenneth Starr, the special prosecutor, that was all unfolding, and he was giving his opinion on this terrible scandal that was, besmirching.
Where's morals in the American presidency?
Yeah, exactly. But he obviously took a bit of a shine to me, or maybe he was just schmoozing, because he asked if I would like to play golf with him. And I explained that my wife was about to have a baby and I didn't want to be on the golf course when she was in labour. And when my son was having his 21st, we were going through stuff that, had been relevant through his life to build, one of those embarrassing videos, that you do at your children's 21st. And I found the old micro cassette and I managed to get it digitised and put some grabs from Donald Trump, because he was president when my son was turning 21, inviting me to go and have a drink with him and play golf with him, and me saying, no, I can't, no, my son's coming. And so that's in his video, and he thought that was pretty cool.
Podcast? Broadcast? This is Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app or abc.net.au/conversations.
After these years in Hong Kong, you and Ruth and your growing family moved back to Brisbane and you began working again with the Courier Mail. You and Ruth were asleep in bed one night in 2002 when shots rang out. What happened?
Yeah, so we were just getting off to sleep, and the sound of this, very loud banging just jolted us. I thought a tree had come down because it was a really windy evening, and I thought some tree branches had fallen onto the roof of the carport, which was near our bedroom. And Ruth was covered in smithereens of glass, so whatever had happened, had caused the window, our bedroom window, to break, and the bedroom window is sort of directly above our heads in bed. And we then got up and I went downstairs and outside onto the driveway where our neighbours were already standing, and I'm looking for a tree. But our neighbours said, no, there's no tree. You've been shot at. Like, they've just driven off. And, there were four shots fired. And we were astonished and, I think in deep shock. I rang 000 immediately, and then the police were there soon after, and then journalists arrived, and it all got pretty weird.
Were you working on a particular story at that point, Hedley, that this might have been connected with, or what did you think was going on?
Yes, I was, and we'd had some threatening phone calls. I'd had a threat. My wife had received a threatening phone call at home from a person who said he was purporting to be a police officer, and his story was, I'm not meant to be making this call, but I want to warn you that Hedley's in danger and the police know about it, but they're probably not going to say anything because it's relating to his story and they're doing their own investigations. But, I couldn't not disclose this. I actually think that was garbage, and that it was somebody who'd come up with a plausible story and was then impersonating a police officer to try to warn me off doing the story. The story hadn't yet been published, but they knew I was working on it. I'd been doing some investigation for a while. It was connected to a very significant property scam involving tens of millions of dollars. And so after we got that telephone threat, I made a decision that the best way to deal with it was to bring the story publication forward and get it out there, because the risk to us, if there was a risk, was while it was still being developed. But once it was done, their fingerprints would be all over it if anything should happen to us. But I don't know whether it was connected to that story.
What, did the police not find the culprit?
No. So they found the weapon. It was a high caliber revolver that had been thrown into a creek near our house. They got a partial description of the car, and they got a partial DNA sample from the weapon. And for weeks afterwards, the police, were investigating, and the police commissioner even gave me and my editor some briefings about what was going on. But there was no resolution to it.
It must have been terrifying, Hedley. Did you and Ruth think about moving, or what were the days and weeks after that like for you and your family?
Yeah, I think for the first couple of weeks, and we went to Tasmania to just try to put some distance between what had happened and the public interest and the journalism that was unfolding around it, and our children and ourselves. So we spent a fortnight driving around Tassie and trying to just shield the children from it. I remember on the plane down just being really paranoid, looking up and down the aisle, thinking, am I being stalked? Is there someone on this flight that was connected to the shooting? And you have all of these pretty irrational ideas at a time like that. When we came back, we got the house fixed up. So there were bullet holes in the garage door, and obviously the glass had been shattered, and one of the bullets had gone into the children's toy room. And so there were repairs to do, and the security officers who worked for News Corp, who worked for Lachlan Murdoch, actually came up, and they did this report on the vulnerabilities, if there were any, in relation to our house. And my editor who got the report said, I actually don't want to show you the document because, your house is pretty exposed and it's not going to make you feel much better if you see the report. So, we moved on from that. But we had an increasingly difficult time, I think, by not addressing the psychological impacts at an early stage. I, in particular, began to become increasingly angry and frustrated, and that then led to me drinking excessively, and then that would make me angrier and then sad, and then what would happen is people would ask me about the shooting in the weeks and months afterwards, and everybody had heard about it because it had been televised and it had been on the front page of the Courier Mail, and there'd been other follow-up stories. So, it wasn't unreasonable for people who I knew and people who I didn't know in conversation to just ask me about it. But when they would ask me and I would try to address the answer, I would actually just have this strange reaction where my eyes would start streaming tears, and then I couldn't talk, and I realised sometime later that it was a response, a bit like a PTSD response, and that I needed to get some help. And Ruth and I understood that already because the anger, not with Ruth, but just at the attack on my family and our home that we loved, all of that was going through my mind all the time. And so I got some help, and I think I got great advice. The woman who was helping me, she was very firm and direct in saying that I should change my lifestyle and that I can get through what now seems so awful and depressing and debilitating. I can get through it and not become a victim of it. And she treated a lot of victims of trauma, police officers, who'd had to go to road accidents and fireys, and people who had dealt with death and destruction on an almost daily basis. And they had been suffering PTSD from their jobs, and as a result, they'd lost their careers. Many of them had lost their families, and they were broken. And she wanted to tell me about that so that she could sort of set up a bit of a crossroad and say, well, you know, if you don't stop doing what you're doing, if you don't change now, then you could end up like that. And that would be, you know, a calamity after, you know, something that your family didn't deserve. And her advice was to elevate my heart rate for 35, 45 minutes every day.
So practical.
Yeah, she said just go and do some really vigorous exercise, whether it's on a bike, whether it's in the gym. You know, she said, do you go swimming? Do something and stop drinking. And I thought, okay, well, it's now or never. I have to really do something. Ruth and I were doing it pretty tough, and our relationship was very frayed. So I decided that I would try to do the swimming part of it. My dad had been a champion swimmer, and I went to the Centenary pool, and I felt pretty awkward at first because, you know, I wasn't a natural swimmer, and sometimes the pool was cold, but I just got into it. And the more I did, the better I felt. And I found that while I was swimming, you know, when I was still really angry, you know, I could yell, but no one could hear. And I just did lap after lap before work. And I also realised that it actually made me a much better thinker and interviewer, because the endorphins and other chemicals that the brain produces as a result of you elevating your heart rate for a period of time make you, I think, a much clearer thinker. And got to the point where I was actually feeling like, you know, I didn't want to do interviews with people where I would have to be on my game unless I'd had a really good swim in the morning beforehand. And it was very good for me. But it also got me through those periods, those dark periods when, you know, it could so easily have gone the other way.
Have you maintained that? Are you still a swimmer?
I should say that when I got over the shooting, I got a bit lazy and decided I was okay again. And then I go through periods where I say, okay, I'm getting right back into it, and I choose swimming. And we've got a lap pool at home, and I'm back into it again.
I want to ask you, Hedley, about a loss that happened in your own family. What did you know about your grandmother, Gladys, when you were growing up?
Yeah, not a lot, Sarah, other than she disappeared when my dad was a teenager. Dad lived on the northern beaches of Sydney, near DY, and you know, his mum and dad, they'd married when Gladys was pretty young. Dad loved his mother very dearly, and his father. And then she disappeared one day, and he never saw her again. And I heard probably more about it from my mother as I was growing up, because we just understood that it was something we didn't want to talk to Dad about, because it would probably upset him. But Mum told us that, you know, she had mental health issues and that they'd found her nightdress on the beach. And that was about as much as I knew. And then as I got older and as Dad got older, we did have some conversations about it, and Dad talked about his mum and her personality and her, you know, wonderful attributes. And, you know, I never delved very deeply because it was still something that I could tell troubled him. But Dad never, ever suggested to me that there was anything other than mental health issues that led to his mum disappearing. And the theory, which I think is right, is that she had decided to swim out from the beach at DY, where her nightdress was found, and keep swimming.
So what was the connection, Hedley, in the timing around your dad and the loss of his mum in that awful, tragic way, and your decision to create this podcast about another missing but murdered woman, Lynette Dawson.
Yeah, well, what happened was Dad died in March 2017, and, we really, really miss Dad. And after Dad died, I felt like I was sort of missing my own bearings because Dad had been a great mentor, and I probably became a little bit unmoored and maybe a bit just questioning whether I wanted to keep doing journalism or do something else. And some months later, when I was thinking about what I would do in journalism if I stayed in journalism, my mind was often going back to the case of Lynn Dawson, now known as Lynn Sims, and this case that I'd first heard about back in 2001 and that I thought, was crying out for a proper investigation because it seemed that her husband had got away with murder. But in 2017, because of the circumstances of Lynn's disappearance from the Northern Beaches, when her children were small, I thought, well, maybe I could do that as a podcast. And if I do it now, it's not going to upset Dad because it won't remind him of his mother Gladys's disappearance. He's not around. And I also felt that I could actually, by, traipsing around the Northern Beaches and travelling from Brisbane to Sydney and spending time in DY and Pittwater and all these places where I knew my dad grew up and sailed and went to school and swam competitively and so on, I could also have, a private connection to Dad while I was doing this work. And although I wasn't ever investigating my grandmother's disappearance, I felt that maybe I could understand things about it through my investigation into what happened to Lynn. So, I just went about Lynn's case and that investigation and developed, some pretty firm ideas at an early stage about what had happened to her. And, I would drive past Dad's childhood home while I was down there and think about, what had happened to Gladys in 1956, which was, 26 years before Lynn disappeared.
And you had that connection, that kind of echo through being there physically. Did it lead you to have any other interpretations or rest with that one that was kind of the story in the family or the accepted explanation in the family that she had taken her own life?
I think you deal with true crime and you look at the cases of women who've disappeared and you think, okay, where was the proper investigation and what was going on in that home at that time? And, it would be naive for anyone to not apply some sort of critical analysis to that in their own family. And I did that, and I came to the view that my grandmother almost certainly did not meet with foul play, that she had known mental health difficulties and that two of her own brothers had similar difficulties and had taken their own lives. So that's where I ended up.
Hedley, this podcast, The Teacher's Pet, became a huge hit, and a few months after it aired, Chris Dawson was arrested and charged with Lynn's murder nearly 40 years before. Were you in the courtroom for the trial and when Chris Dawson was sentenced to 24 years jail for Lynette's murder?
Yeah, I was in the courtroom on a couple of occasions. I was in the courtroom in 2020 when he and his lawyers were attempting to avoid trial altogether by showing that, in their view, the podcast had completely destroyed his chance of getting a fair trial. And so I was being questioned for 3 days by his silk over that. And that legal attempt by Dawson's defence failed. The judge said he could get a fair trial, although she did chastise me for being overly zealous, in her opinion, in my pursuit of Chris Dawson. And I'll admit I was zealous. I think I became righteously angry about what had happened and how she'd been let down by the criminal justice system for many, many years. Then the murder trial proceeded in 2022, and I wasn't attending the trial because it had been made clear that the defence wanted to call me as a witness again. And I stayed away from the actual trial until the day of the verdict. There'd been some weeks from when the trial ended to when Justice Ian Harrison came back with his actual verdict and his reasons. And I was sitting next to Lynn's brother Greg and Greg's wife Marilyn, two lovely people who I remain very good friends with. And behind me was Chris's brother, Paul Dawson, and other members of the Dawson family. And, we didn't know which way it would go. I had a gut feeling that he was going to be convicted because the judge seemed to really get the prosecution case. But we didn't know for sure. Could have easily gone the other way.
How did you react when that guilty verdict was announced?
It was like, a huge burden is taken off the family shoulders, my shoulders. We were enormously relieved. It wasn't elation. It wasn't, celebration, a woo-hoo kind of moment. It wasn't like that. You realise that this man who was then elderly, was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And I felt the mood was sombre in the courtroom after that verdict was delivered, and you could almost feel pity for him. He was soon escorted away, physically escorted with two officers flanking him, and he had a bit of a limp, and so they were sort of helping him as he was dragging his feet and walking across the courtroom and to a doorway which led downstairs to the cells. And, that was a very big moment. But you also felt, and, I can only speak for myself, I felt, well, what a terrible waste. You had a very loving young mum, and everybody knew in 1982 that she just wouldn't have walked out on those kids to start a new life, which was his story. He'd claimed repeatedly that she'd telephoned him a few times and said she needed a bit more time away and all this garbage. But also, how had it taken 40 years for the criminal justice system to finally properly do its job? Why did it take so long when the case, was so plainly obvious, was obvious in 1982? And I thought that the system had failed so many people. It had got it right eventually, whether because in part of my podcast or in large part or no part, whatever. It had taken 40 years to get to that point. And that was, I thought, a real blight.
Did it make you a different journalist, do you think, working on Lynn's story and the impact that it had?
Yeah, it did. It made me realise, as a result of the investigations that were part of my podcast into Lynn's case and what I discovered in that process, it made me realise that cold cases, unsolved cases, when they're subjected to a fresh set of eyes and a podcast treatment, throw up new evidence, new witnesses and new evidence that you would have thought just didn't exist come forward. And I think that is partly because of the relationship that people have with audio, that you have with your listeners. People are more motivated to respond than if, for example, they read another story in the pages of the newspaper or in a magazine. The inflections and the authenticity and the genuineness that people can respond to in audio makes a difference, and it causes them to come forward. And also people who have known something and not wanted to share it with the police in the early years, they grow and they change and they become more mature and less fearful. And so a podcaster comes along and asks for help, public help. And those people who had been tight-lipped when police were doing their early investigations contact me. They don't know whether police are re-investigating. They don't have connections with police. A lot of them say that they don't feel comfortable talking to police first. They'd rather trust me as a journalist. And so they share information that is often really probative and striking and important, and it just shows how much potential there is with podcasts and deep diving investigations into unsolved murders, particularly of women, because these cases were so badly investigated for many years in Australia. Like, you just shake your head. And that's the other learning for me. I've realised that there are amazing detectives who do incredibly good work and they're dedicated, and I don't have any animus against police generally, but there are also appallingly incompetent, negligent, lazy investigations, and then the system just marches on and there's a new case, and that unsolved case just goes to the bottom of the pile and back of the filing cabinet. And it's I think a great service that journalism can do to try to reignite these cases, to put them in front of the police again and prosecutors so that they can listen and hopefully follow and realise there's still hope for a family to get justice, for a victim to be recognised, and for the system to do what it should have done in the first place.
Hedley, it's been so interesting to hear just some of your stories. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
It's been a real privilege. Thank you, Sarah.
Hedley Thomas was my guest on Conversations. This story was produced by Nicola Harrison and recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.